screen is going behind me? Or is there
Screens aside, screens
Side screens. But
for here. I think you'll sit there at the, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And, of course, our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And we will post the program within 24 hours on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion today is Darren Baxt. He is our research fellow in agricultural policy in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. He studies and writes about agriculture subsidies, property rights, environmental policy, food labeling, and related issues. Prior to joining us this year, he was a policy counsel for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He also served as Director of Legal and Regulatory Studies for 7 years at the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina, where he concentrated there on property rights and environmental policy. He serves on the Federalist Society's Environmental Law and Property Rights Executive Committee, and previously was a member of the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force of the American Legislative Exchange Council. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Darren Baxt. Darren?
thank you, John. I appreciate it. When you do a program on food police, there's kind of this idea that we're talking about really absurd policies, and in some ways the absurdity of the policies undermine maybe how serious the issue really is. Because when we take a step back and think about it, think about what the government is actually doing. They are trying to actually influence what you're going to eat, and in some ways not only influence but actually dictate that you can eat some things and not eat other things. So that's something that should be taken extremely seriously. And we're talking about the basic need of eating. It's a big deal. One of the things that I've done, and hopefully you received a couple of papers as you're coming in, I've written a couple of papers on just kind of this general issue of the government intervention in our eating, plus a paper on the Obamacare menu labeling rule as well. And when I was looking at the Obamacare menu labeling rule, what I saw was kind of this arrogance of government, this idea that, one, consumers don't know for themselves what they should eat, and also, even as they're making choices to eat something, they're making misinformed choices. And it's up to the government to actually fix those problems. And that's exactly what's happening with the menu labeling rule. The FDA, which is implementing that rule, acknowledges that the market is behaving properly in the sense that consumers are asking and seeking for nutritional information. We can go across the street, right next door to Subway, and see that they are reacting to the market and providing nutritional information. And businesses are also reacting by providing nutritional information to address the need for consumer demand. The problem, though, according to the FDA, is that we're still making misinformed choices because we're not making the choices that the government thinks we should be making. Now, when we go to a restaurant, for example, we don't always make the choice, the healthiest choice, because, quite honestly, there's a lot of factors when we go into a restaurant. We don't go to a fancy steakhouse to celebrate an anniversary dinner and decide we're going to get steamed cauliflower. We're going to get a filet, or whatever it might be. Nutrition might be one issue, or it may not be, but it's certainly just simply going to be one of those issues. So the key problem is that while we may be talking about menu labeling right now on the federal level, as long as if there's failed policy and the public doesn't react the way the government would like it to, well, then the government will continue to go further and further until we start seeing consumers taking the actions that the government would like us to do, which might mean bans, like we see in New York City, or at least an attempt to ban soda, or other, like food taxes, for example. Oftentimes, the nanny state is used to reference these types of actions. But I always think this is too nice of a statement because it presumes we got Mary Poppins on our hands. And this is not Mary Poppins. This is a lot of people in the government and nutrition czars who think that they know what's best. It's about control, and in many ways, it's also about their interest in trying to reduce health costs, which are not actually a very legitimate interest, as we'll hear. But it's not about caring about you, it's about caring about themselves and their own perceived notion of where they are and kind of controlling our lives. So I always try to stay away from the nanny state language. It seems sweet. Now what I'm going to do is introduce the panelists. What we're going to do is we'll have them have their introductory remarks, and then I'll have some questions for them, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. From your far right, and actually we switched it up here. All right, okay, it's the other way around. Your far left, and we'll just go that way. Balin Linekin is going to talk about current developments regarding the food police. And Balin is the founder and executive director of Keep Food Legal, a Washington, D.C. based nonpartisan grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates in favor of food freedom, the right of every American to grow, raise, produce, buy, sell, share, cook, eat, and drink the foods of their own choosing. He writes a weekly column on food law and policy for Reason Magazine's website and serves as an adjunct faculty at American University, where he recently taught an undergraduate course on food and social media. Balin's writing on food law and policy has appeared in the Hastings Constitutional Law Quarterly, Chapman University Law Review, New York Post, Baltimore Sun, Huffington Post, Food Safety News, Oxford Encyclopedia of Food and Drink in America, and many other publications. Then, Dr. Nita Gay will be discussing the rationale behind government intervention, including kind of the economic rationale behind government intervention. She'll talk about behavioral economics as well. She is a policy research editor at the Mercatus Center. Prior to coming to Mercatus, Nita was at the Cato Institute. Previously, she was on the faculty at the George Mason University School of Law and Northwestern University Law School, following a clerkship at the Maryland Court of Appeals, the state's highest court. Before going to law school, Nita was a member of the editorial board at the Economic Times in New Delhi after working at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. She writes a weekly column for the Washington Times and has published op-eds in Newsweek, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Star Ledger, the Daily Caller, and other news outlets. Her scholarly articles have been cited in the Harvard Law Review and other journals. J. Justin Wilson, Justin will be discussing the changing government role and the public's food decisions. He is a senior research analyst at the Center for Consumer Freedom, where he focuses his research on food and consumer issues. Justin is a frequent critic of government paternalism and the nanny state. Wilson argues that policymakers must recognize the difference between public and private health, especially with respect to regulatory strategies aimed at addressing obesity. He's the author of the book, An Epidemic of Obesity Myths, which questions a number of the underlying assumptions used to justify government intervention to combat obesity, as well as Small Choices, Big Bodies, which examines existing literature on the causes of obesity. He's a frequent contributor to numerous print and broadcast media outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, as well as ABC, NBC, CNN, and Fox News. And finally, Walter Olson will discuss the proper role of government in the public's food decisions. Walter Olson is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies. Prior to joining Cato, Olson was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and has been a columnist for Great Britain's Times Online, as well as Reason. His writing appears regularly in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the New York Post. He has appeared numerous times before Congress and advised many public officials. The Washington Post has dubbed him the intellectual guru of tort reform. His approximately 400 broadcast appearances, include all the major networks, CNN, Fox News, PBS, NPR, and Oprah. He is the author of numerous high-profile and widely praised books, including his most recent book, which I think was 2011, Schools for Misrule, Legal Academy, and an Overlawyered America. And we will get started with Dan. Thank you.
PowerPoint is somewhere in there.
Yeah, let's draw detail on. God. Let's see. Yeah, that's great. Great, and password. Hang on one second. Technical difficulties. All right, let me run out and see if I can get someone real quick.
Go ahead, I'll get you started. He has the password written on his hand. Just FYI. Awesome, there we go. Thank you very much. All right. Sorry, everyone, for the delay. Darren, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to the Heritage Foundation for inviting me to appear on this panel. As Darren mentioned, I'm Balin Linnegan, Executive Director of Keep Food Legal, and I'm going to talk about some updates on food police issues. And I was going to talk about my love of steamed, what was it, broccoli or?
Cauliflower?
Cauliflower, sorry, but apparently that's out of the question. Can you advance the screen for me, please? Bottom right corner. Thank you. All right, so Darren's not a fan generally of the term nanny state. I tend not to use it either. I'm also not a huge fan personally of the term food police because it focuses largely on state power. My interest more is in individual rights. So I tend to use the term food freedom, but I think we're all talking about the same thing, just from a sort of a different direction. Just a quick overview, I'm going to talk about some federal, then state, then local developments dealing with food freedom or the food police. And then the most difficult part, I'm actually going to try to point out where the government's getting it right in some places. Can you advance to the next slide? Thank you very much. Okay, so first up, Darren briefly touched on his introductory remarks on menu labeling under the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare. I mentioned here that it's complicated. It is. I mean, I'm no fan of mandatory menu labeling. I think voluntary menu labeling is great, but under the Affordable Care Act, we have a system which in some ways makes sense, even if I'm opposed to it. It basically, its origins lie, as many bad food laws do, in California. And if we look back a few years, California was the first state in the nation to enact mandatory menu labeling statewide. It did so actually at the behest of the California Restaurant Association, which may seem surprising. But it turns out that rather than having, say, McDonald's face 100 different menu labeling laws around the state, the Restaurant Association said, you know what, let's just have one uniform state law that applies equally to everyone, I think with more than 15 locations. And the public health community, for the most part, was on board with that. So that success, if you will, in California, which again, I'm not fond of the outcome, but that success was mimicked by the National Restaurant Association, which said instead of 50 different state laws, you know, that McDonald's and others would have to comply with, why not have one national law? So that's what we have under Obamacare. And the part that makes it slightly more complicated is that it was intended to be to apply to restaurants with certain, 20 or more locations, I think. But it's also now possibly going to apply to pizza chains, to groceries that sell food inside. The pizza issue is particularly vexing because I think Domino's did a study or crunched the numbers or whatever they did statistically and found that there are 34 million different menu choices at Domino's. So you can see how quickly 34 million different calorie counts in any Domino's location would be somewhat difficult. it's very costly too. Even, sort of a rudimentary calorie count is going to cost at least, I think, $5,000 per sign per location for a Domino's. You multiply that times however many locations they have, and that's pretty serious. There are some other issues in this slide. I'm happy to talk about them during the Q&A, but I'm, in the interest of time, going to ask Darren, please, to go ahead. Thanks. All right, so the Z in Zion should be capitalized, but I guess we're using different versions of PowerPoint. But moving on to the state level, there are a lot of really bad state laws around the country that sort of reek of the food police. The Zion curtain, while by no means the most pervasive, I think is the dumbest. Basically, you can see there's a gentleman here in what looks to be and what is a walk-in freezer. He's getting some alcohol. In Utah, it's illegal to have people see you pouring alcohol in a restaurant. So if you go up to the bartender and you say, "Hey, I'd love a pint of beer," he'd say, "Sure," and sort of, turn around like a mad scientist or something, giggling. So, I mean, they have literal curtains set up in some places, but they also have walk-in freezers that would better be used for freezing, say, food, but have to be used for things like mixing drinks. I mean, I think that in the interest of openness and expedience and all sorts of other things, and, craft cocktails, there's not too much craft if the bartender comes back and you pay something to watch them mix the drink. So that's one of the dumber sort of food police state laws. My favorite thing about this is the unintended consequence, which is that it's okay to mix at bars, but not at restaurants. And so a lot of former restaurants in Utah now are bars. So it's an anti-alcohol law that is, as these laws always do, has the unintended consequence of creating more bars. There are also ag-gag laws. I think there are 6 or 7 around the country. Basically, they're laws that try to prevent groups like PETA, which I'm personally no fan of, the Humane Society, and others who go into farms and record practices that I think most people, consider to be anywhere between sort of ugly and abominable. And then they put the videos up online, and then they use that to raise money for their pet cause, no pun intended. I'm no fan of PETA breaking into a farm and videotaping something, but the part that I have the problem with is not the videotaping, but the breaking in part. So if you break into a farm, you should be arrested and prosecuted and possibly sued. If you have some sort of video that shows animal abuse, this is part of the marketplace of ideas. You should be allowed to share that with the public. PETA has the same First Amendment rights that you and I do. And so that's another state law that thankfully is not too pervasive, but in farm states, Iowa and others, it is pretty pervasive. Could you please go to the next slide? Thanks. Okay, and then this gentleman here in the photo may seem familiar to you, I'm not sure. That's New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. New York City soda ban, I don't know that there's a ton more I can say about it other than the fact that when I respond to a question that Darren will ask later, the reason that that there is no soda ban currently is that soda makers fought back, and I think that that's probably a lesson to use the courts to your advantage when someone's trying to take away your rights to engage in a lawful business practice. The second example there, sharing food with the homeless, that's also banned in New York City and in some other locales, Orlando, Las Vegas, Philadelphia. The ACLU sued Philadelphia, and in New York City at least, Mayor Bloomberg said that it was a result of him not being certain what the salt, fat, and calorie content of the food that one might share with the homeless was. So Snickers, that's exactly what you should be doing. Snickers and outrage, and that's really about all that is worth. The next slide, please. Okay, so where government's getting it right. This slide took much longer to put together than all the others combined. Cottage food laws, they allow small entrepreneurs to cook food in their home, prepare food in their home, spices, breads, other what are awkwardly termed non-potentially hazardous foods. More than 40 states now have those laws. That's a good thing. It's helping small entrepreneurs. Food sovereignty, I'll skip, and then deregulating existing markets. The USDA, again, I'm not a fan of much of what they do, but they recently deregulated salumi, sausage, things like that you can now get from Italy, and you haven't been able to get in more than, I think, 30 years. So there is actually some deregulation happening, and that is the good news when it does happen. I think that's probably about all the time I have and all I have to say. So, thank you very much.
That's a hard act to follow, but okay, I'm going to talk about stuff that's a tiny bit more boring, but hopefully it'll help you with the framework for the more interesting things that I'm going to follow. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be here at Heritage. I'm going to talk about the rationale, at least the offered rationales for government intervention. And the focus I'm going to use is obesity because that's sort of a big thing here, especially childhood obesity. There has been a growing incidence of child obesity, which is a marker for a host of illnesses in adulthood. And this has been offered as a rationale for government intervention. And the fact that childhood obesity is growing, that childhood diabetes is growing, is troubling and is indeed tragic. Ironically, this is also a sign of success. This is that the United States is enormously wealthy and that redistribution programs are successful. As an aside, I grew up in India. Okay, so there the concern is people starving. I mean, nobody poor is obese. Okay, so the fact that we actually worry about obesity is really a sign of just how extremely wealthy this country is. So keep that in mind. Okay, and the thing is, while a decrease in child obesity and obesity in adults is desirable, government intervention is not really likely to be successful. And the reason is because there is really no market failure in the traditional understanding of the term, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. And any kind of regulatory interventions that seek to modify behavior are just not really going to be successful in reducing obesity. To the extent that we as taxpayers bear the cost of medical treatment related to obesity through various government-funded programs, what you can actually argue is we have a problem of government failure, not market failure. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the traditional rationales for government intervention and regulation, and also how behavioral economics provided regulators with grounds to nudge people, which is the basis for all these food bans and all these other issues, all the other interesting things that Justin and Walter will talk about, and why government intervention is going to be neither effective and it's not desirable because government intervention is not costless. I mean, all these regulations are expensive. Okay, first, what is the scope of the problem? Okay, the thing is, we all talk about, there are all these obese children we have to worry about. Fact is, according to the CDC, the incidence of childhood obesity is roughly 10 to 12% in households with income exceeding 350% of poverty level, and even in poor households, that is, with an income of roughly about 130% poverty level, the incidence is less than 20%. What that means is that 80% of poor kids, of the kids that are at the highest risk, are not in fact obese. Which means that any kind of regulatory solution that is imposed is going to impose costs on 80% of people who are not at risk. Okay. So traditionally, the way regulation works is, the government comes in and says, okay, let's see, is there a market failure? Is there any way intervention can make things better? And what is market failure? Is when the market outcome, whatever the market outcome is really not optimal in some way. And traditionally, there's the two things: there are external costs, or there's asymmetric information. Okay? So the cost that one party's transaction does not bear, that's external costs, or there's an information asymmetry, that is one party in the transaction has better information. And so what you end up with is regulatory agencies then mitigated harms like pollution, which is your standard sort of thing when we think of external costs, because this is a cost that society at large bears. Or you have things like unsafe products, where the manufacturer has better information about the safety of a product than the consumer. and you have public health efforts that focused on containing contagious diseases. The thing is, none of those really apply when it comes to food and obesity. Okay? There really isn't any information asymmetry. What's funny was I was talking about this with Richard Williams, who was at the FDA before he came to Mercatus. Turns out when the FDA started discussing labeling with food manufacturers, but putting all the stuff, turns out they didn't know anything about nutritional content either. Anyone in the consumers did. And at this point, all of this is moot. I mean, that ship sailed long since. So we have nutritional labeling, and presumably this is actually just getting more onerous. Technology has changed. It's relatively easy and cheap to find information. It's very, very easy to find information. And the thing is, the obesity rate is still growing. So information asymmetry isn't where the action is. That's not where things are going. So on the other hand, you don't really have an external cost in that obesity and diabetes and these other diseases are not contagious. This is not whooping cough. This is not measles. This is not typhoid. There's an external cost, yes, in that taxpayer-funded healthcare costs go up, but that's not a true external cost. This is a cost that has come about because, the government has chosen to intervene in the market, which is entirely different. I mean, this is not the traditional definition. So, and in any case, it's really, really difficult to claim that the market isn't working. Do you know what the market is worth in terms of options? I mean, if you want to go out and try to lose weight, it's $61 billion worth of options out there as of this year. Okay? And this is a whole array of things, You can get foods delivered to your home. You can take diet pills, no guarantees on their safety, unfortunately, it turns out. You can go to Weight Watchers. You can do all kinds of different things, Or you can do the old-fashioned thing, which is what I do, is I go walk my dogs. You can get apps on your phone to track what you eat. I mean, there are lots and lots of things you can do. Okay? And there's plenty of evidence, too, that these weight loss companies are constantly tweaking their offerings. They will attract specific demographic groups. So the market is innovating. It's very difficult to say that there is market failure in that there aren't, if you are obese, if you're overweight and you want to lose weight, there are lots and lots of options out there. Okay? But you still have lots and lots of overweight people, right? So why, right? So what is the explanation? It's behavioral economics, and this behavioral economics infuses some insights from psychology into our somewhat dismal science. This has an explanation. So there's a class of errors. There are all kinds of cognitive errors we make, evidently, because we are not rational people, unlike sort of the model of neoclassical economics, right? Individually, we're not rational all the time. That should really come as a surprise to everybody, right? I make this cognitive error all the time. I'm really optimistic. If I hit the right organizational tools, my kids will stop being messy. It doesn't work. But there's also another class of errors. It's called self-control errors. Okay, there's a more specific subclass. It's called hyperbolic discounting. And I just feel like all of us have done this at some point or the other. So you value immediate gratification more than future well-being. So the pleasure you get from eating that cupcake right now, or that beer, or the big gulp, or the extra serving of fries, or whatever floats your boat. That's outweighed by the risk of the weight gain or whatever health problems you may have in the future. So armed with this insight, right? Now this, from behavioral economics, this allows regulators to shift their focus. Okay, so you're no longer trying to mitigate harm from traditional market failure. Now the regulators can try to mitigate harm that individual cause themselves from what the regulators view as irrational choices. And in this case, these choices cause obesity. Okay, so the regulator says, since you, poor citizen, you lack self-control, okay, I will make the decision for you. I will help you. Okay, and how will I do this? I will make choices in terms of what are the school lunches that will be served to your children. Doesn't matter if your kids won't eat them and go hungry instead. Okay, that doesn't really matter. Okay, or I guess since everybody else is talking about it, I can say, I can try and ban the 20-ounce soda. Or no more Happy Meals in the McDonald's, in the meals, so your kids can't get any toys with the Happy Meals. Or it can be anything else. Or it can be something that can still preserve consumer choice the way the menu labels do, so that seems somewhat more benign. But even that isn't costless. The thing is, so all these regulations do have costs. They have dollar costs as well as costs in terms of taking away choices, in taking away liberties. And things, they don't work. They don't work for a number of reasons. For one thing, regulators are subject to the exact same cognitive biases that the rest of us are. There's no reason to believe that regulators are any more rational than we are. Okay? In fact, of all people, Justice Breyer has pointed that regulators are particularly prone to tunnel vision. So they tend to lose sight of the bigger picture. They will tend to focus on small costs, on smaller problems, instead of lose sight of the big picture, and you end up with regulations that are actually not, that deal with problems that are really not that big in the scheme of things. Okay? Then there is what is, I guess, like a good libertarian, I have to refer to this. This is the Hayekian knowledge problem. Right? There's no reason to believe that regulators have sufficient information. Okay? There's no reason to believe that they have sufficient information to make informed choices for consumers, or even to make, even for effective policy making. But what's going to happen is, as soon as you have regulation, as soon as you have these regulations that require whatever, if they have the 34 million menu options, whatever, this is resources that have to be diverted to satisfy regulation. That means that a fewer resources are left for innovation, to satisfy consumers. In fact, calorie counts and menu labeling, this is really heavily favored as a nudge regulatory tool. But the thing is, there are lots of surveys, there's lots of information out there. There's a Mercatus paper actually that's really good that actually goes through this, that tells people don't count calories systematically. Even when you have that app on your phone, people necessarily don't actually enter everything on that app. And the thing is, purchasing habits don't necessarily change. What you order off a menu doesn't necessarily change. But the thing is, every time you have these requirements, it adds to the costs of the restaurant, it adds to the cost of the food manufacturer. And the other thing is, it reduces flexibility. Because if you have to print up new menus every time, it reduces flexibility in terms of experimenting with new menus. And that is sort of this unseen cost that doesn't show up. That doesn't really get counted anywhere. It's also worth remembering, some of these things that pop up, these innovations. Have you guys seen those 100-calorie packs? I've seen them at Trader Joe's. They actually these are entirely private sector innovations. Okay? And generally, regulatory solutions by their nature will be one size fits all. The private sector is going to be, they're going to have a lot of, there are a lot of options. They are constantly innovating. The thing is that they can also possibly unintended consequences from government intervention. Remember, the government encouraged people to eat low-fat diets with lots of refined carbs. What you ended up with, people getting hungry and eating even more and actually becoming even more overweight. Bottom line is, there's really no silver bullet to curing obesity, and there's no reason to believe that any of these regulatory options will be effective in any way. The thing is, there's plenty of evidence that overweight people know they're overweight, they know, and that they're motivated to lose weight, and they know what their options are. Regulations, either way, are not really going to change anything. They're just going to add the costs. Thank you.
Can I just stay here?
Yep.
Does that work for you? Everyone can hear me, see me? Great. I'm one of the few people who actually keeps track of all the calories that I eat, and I actually have it on my phone. So, be that as it may.
Exception that proves the rule.
No, I mean, exactly. I guess, when you do obesity policy for a living, you have to practice what you preach, which means I have to go to the gym more than I like to because I like to eat too
Kelly
much.
Brownell doesn't.
This is very true. If you've ever seen Kelly Brownell from now at Duke, previously at Yale, he's the nation's foremost obesity expert, and he is a large man. And he admits that the reason he put on weight, he's the biggest advocate for government intervention, and when he was finally cornered on C-SPAN, well, why are you overweight? He said, well, I didn't get a lot of exercise when I was writing my last book. And I went, so wait a minute, your weight was personal irresponsibility, but the rest of the country is government, the lack of government regulation and corporate overreaching. So I want to provide some historical context for the framework that we use to understand public policy regulations specifically related to obesity, and then also give sort of a detailed example of how this is not working in sort of with respect to sin taxes and soda taxes. So there's, I think, the old world public health paradigm sought to protect us from that was public, things that we could not protect ourselves from. The best example is sort of the advent of epidemiology, which occurred during the spread of cholera, and an academic then sort of realized that if you looked at all the wells and you looked at where people had cholera, it was around the wells. And that was the birth of epidemiology, also sort of to a certain extent the birth of a recognition that we needed to have a more sanitary environment. Now, I guess that means that I think it's a legitimate government interest to regulate, as you were explaining, where there's either asymmetric information or other negative externalities related with pollution. So in that respect, I think that the government and the public health authority has a lot of legitimacy in regulating things like wastewater runoff that would go into a river and flow into a community that might be then drawing water from it, or air pollution, contagious diseases, and I think sort of on the edge of what libertarians on the panel all might be a little bit concerned about, compulsory vaccination. That is a situation where it's sort of we're rooted in protecting us. I sometimes like to say we're protecting ourselves from each other, and that we've given the government that ability, right? We're protecting ourselves from the bad actors in the world who don't cover their mouth when they cough, and so we're okay with the government doing certain things to reduce that. So like a good example of it, I think, is when I'm debating people about food safety, I'll say, look, there is not a single American who is going to argue with you and say, I have a God-given right to tainted meat, that we should not allow the USDA to have any regulations about how meat is handled safely. And maybe from a theoretical perspective, we could have an entirely, functioning private meat market. Balin, I'm sure we could talk about this some other time. Yeah. But from a pragmatic perspective, right now that system seems to work. We have sporadic food safety outbreaks, we have E. coli in spinach or whatever it may be. But there's not a lot of people who think that that's an obvious case of government overreaching, because I think to a certain extent it's very difficult to protect yourselves from, for instance, a cow that was slaughtered and the spinal cord was severed, and that meat has been tainted potentially with mad cow causing prions that you can't cook and kill. And you can't obviously protect yourself from. You can't look at it and say, oh, there's the prions, I'm not going to eat that piece of meat. So that is, I think, the construct that old public health operated in, protecting us from each other, protecting us in public spaces, preventing the spread of contagious diseases. The trouble is that we were really good at that. Public health has been very, very good. And these are not, it's a $3 billion a year industry. It's not quite $61 billion in the weight loss industry, but in terms of just the public sector, public health industry, there's billions of dollars being spent to do this. But they were way too effective, and these people have pension funds and they have careers they want to make. And I think they recognized that the mission creep was to change what was once considered public health and to switch it to private health. That you can go up the chain a bit more and say, you know what we really need to do is protect people from themselves, because that's where our problems are occurring now, right? They're looking at what's slowing the increase in life expectancy, and they recognize now it's individual bad behavior, risk-taking. And when I talk about risk-taking here, I'm talking about big risks, like I'm a whitewater kayaker. I take great big risks and throw myself off waterfalls. And I take really, really small risks, like going to an Indian buffet and eating way too much food. I get pleasure from both of those, and so do you guys, right? And we have this risk-taking model that is small risks, small pleasures, big risks, big pleasures, but they all sort of are what make life interesting. So the trouble with the new public health paradigm in protecting us from ourselves is that it's inherently paternalistic, but also that it is impossible to take into account the fact that we all have different risk tolerances. That some people, like my father, say things like, if I die 2 years earlier because of all the cheeseburgers that I ate, then, great. Because if I had to give up every single one of those cheeseburgers, and I'm always like, Dad, I don't want you to die. Dad, let's not talk about this. But he says, if I have to die 2 years earlier because of all those cheeseburgers that I ate, it's the worst 2 years of my life, and I really enjoyed those cheeseburgers. Well, the difficulty is that in the public health paradigm, there is this new public health paradigm, there is this emphasis on maximum life expectancy. That at all times we are all trying to live as long as possible, or at least as healthy and thus as long as possible. Well, that's really complicated. So for instance, most of the epidemiological research would suggest that a severe calorie-restricted diet, there's this sort of group of pseudo-vegans, raw foodists, sort of the fringe of the strange diet world, who believe in calorie restriction, and they will eat 11, or they will eat below technically what their body needs to stay warm and not shiver. They have the longest life expectancy, and it is a sad, sad existence. I mean, a friend of mine is a raw foodist. He has not had a piece of food that has been cooked above 112 degrees in about 13 years. He eats a lot of vegetables. And he also admits that he does this for health reasons, but he's also jaundiced because he doesn't get enough, of the things to prevent that. The difficulty here, though, is, right, we all have different priorities, and when the new public health paradigm steps in, says we're going to regulate how you are protecting and taking the interplay between the risks that you take and the maximum health benefits that we want you to have, there's an enormous number of consumer choices that are then put at stake. So while no one argues against the idea that we should have government regulations to ensure that our food supply is safe, there's an enormous number of people who think that safety is very different from healthy. And I think that's real problematic. So let's look at that sort of from how the difficulty of government intervention in that world sort of is playing out with respect to soda taxes. There's this new fight to tax soda at a penny per ounce. That number, by the way, was made up because it's catchy. There's not a single economist who could say that a penny per ounce just so happens that it was, 0.0001, and we rounded up to 1 penny because that was the right amount to actually reduce soda to the amount that actually reduced consumption. In fact, what most of the academic research, in fact, coming out of Mercatus has found is that you need to tax soda at 1,200% to see a substantial reduction to the point that it would be a measurable reduction in obesity. 1,200%, that's a $9 can of soda. Now, the reason for that is that soda is only 7% of our daily caloric intake. And so in order to reduce 7% by an amount large enough that won't be replaced with beer or milk or juice, you basically have to make it impossible to drink soda pop. So these soda taxes are known as Pigouvian taxes. The idea with the Pigouvian tax, and the reason they just never work, is that you place a tax on a product with the idea that it'll create two different benefits. The first is that the tax will reduce consumption of the product. The second is that the money that you then reap from those who still choose to consume it will be used to ultimately go into programs to reduce consumption of the product. It becomes a self-defunding tax program where increasingly people stop using the product, which means there's less money, but that means that there's already fewer people that need that money to then pay for reduction. The problem, of course, is what we've seen with tobacco taxes. Classic Pigouvian taxes, or they're called sin taxes for those sort of synonymous. Only one state actually uses all of the revenue from their tobacco taxes to actually fund anti-tobacco taxation efforts. Just one. The rest of them have then raided those funds for general purpose or whatever it is. In fact, it created such an incredibly perverse incentive that when Minnesota won a judgment independent of the multi-state judgment against the tobacco companies and was awarded multi-billions of dollars, the attorneys general of the remaining states that got the larger lump sum wrote to the judge in the Minnesota example and said, please don't give Minnesota so much money because you'll put the tobacco companies out of business, and we need them to stay in business so that we can keep funding our health departments. Not making these things up. So in the case of the soda taxes, there's 3 reasons why they won't work. First of all, soda taxes don't actually reduce obesity rates. Soda is a small percentage of that, and there's not a single academic study that seems to suggest that it would, except for actually the aforementioned Kelly Brownell, who did some grade school-based economics without actually looking at the hard data. Beyond that, they're a frustrating encroachment on personal liberties, as we've seen with the degree of unpopularity that they've seen in New York City. And even beyond that, the degree of revenue that they seem to generate is what should be seen for what it really is, which is a grab for money from state governments that are otherwise looking for other things to tax that are easy to get at. So in the end, I think when we look at what's illegitimate, and I'm going to do what Balin did and say, within the framework that I set out, there's old public health and new public health. I personally don't have a problem when the government tries to do things to incentivize people for doing things in the public space that also has dividends. So for instance, there's a great study that shows that kids that grow up next to baseball diamonds, running or parks, or bike paths are about 60% less likely to be obese than those that don't. And we see that that's an obvious, easy government policy that has an enormous number of dividends. And it also leads to sort of a different mindset, which is that I think those on the other side who have an anti-corporate bent generally want to blame corporations and limit personal choice, whereas I think a more responsible way to approach it is to say, what do people enjoy doing? You know what people don't enjoy doing? Dieting. There's not anyone out who's like, oh, I can't wait until I don't get to eat anymore. But there's an enormous number of policies that allow people to maximize things that they enjoy and also reduce obesity. I think that lies government's sort of sweet spot.
Thanks. Thank you. Darren has given me 8 minutes and asked me to describe the proper role of government in the public's food decisions. What he should have realized is that I'm a libertarian from the Cato Institute. I don't need 8 minutes. I don't even need 1 minute to describe the proper role of government in the public's food decisions. Quote, protect individual rights, curb force and fraud, then butt out. According to my count, it leaves 77 characters. You could put it in a tweet and have room for 3 pictures of interesting French cheeses that you're not allowed to buy, or whatever pictures you want to put in. So that leaves me the rest of my time to talk about why this is important, and in particular, I would say why it's important even if you are not one of these urban foodies. This panel, let's face it, is heavy on urban foodie types and somewhat light on farmers, but it's too often thought that it's those groups who care about food policy and somehow or other everyone else should be ignoring it. Well, I'm here to say that even if you don't know the difference between a Cornichon and a Cornish hen, you may not be interested in this topic, but as Trotsky said of war, it is interested in you. And whether you care about parental freedom, in Chicago, a school recently tried to forbid parents from packing lunches to send in with their kids because the school could not monitor how nutritious and non-fattening those lunches were. Whether you are in New York City, where, and I was at the Manhattan Institute during many of the peak years of Bloombergism, where, we're going to miss him so much, aren't we, when he's not mayor. But my favorite of all of them is when the city health department announced that it was going to try to make high blood sugar a reportable disorder. That is, like many contagious or communicable diseases, you would have to let the health department know that you had a high blood sugar score, and they explained that this was in order to make possible certain future, quote, interventions, unquote. I didn't ask what the interventions were because I was too afraid of what the answer might be. Well, the fact is that whether or not you care about what you eat, the civil liberties implications, the personal liberty implications are interested in you. At my website, Overlawyered, 2 years ago, I ran an item under the heading, Harvard researchers want fat kids taken from their homes. A pair of Harvard scholars writing in the Journal of the American Medical Association, you can't really get more prestigious than that combination, advocate stripping away the custody rights of parents of super obese children. Quote, despite the discomfort posed by state intervention, it may sometimes be necessary to protect a child, said a lawyer and researcher at Harvard's School of Public Health. That combination frightens me all by itself. And they, another sentence from the JAMA piece, even relatively mild parenting deficiencies, such as having excessive junk food in the home or failing to model a physically active lifestyle, may contribute to a child's weight problem, unquote. The fact is, if you look at constitutional history, a lot of the history of Fourth Amendment search and seizure law comes from the law of contraband, and the law of contraband basically comes from an attempt to prohibit the possession or trade of things that people would voluntarily like to possess or trade. We are not yet very far down the road of forfeiture, informants, anonymous snitch lines, bounty hunters, infiltration, and yet we have seen some of that. We've seen it in police infiltrating raw milk groups, which of course are selling the milk voluntarily, so they have to pose as an interested consumer. We are getting down that road when it is reported last week in the New York press that city inspectors are interested in unlawful dinner parties. These being ones where, yes, money changes hands. You go to someone's house, they cook dinner there, you eat their dinner, and as the inspectors pointed out in the New York Post or wherever it was, the city hasn't had a chance to inspect it, even though someone's cooking dinner for money for someone else. Well, I wouldn't have thought that that could get very far, and yet New York City is the place where you can get written up and ticketed for possessing an ashtray in your office, even if no one can prove that it was ever used for anything. It's paraphernalia, like drug paraphernalia. So the freedom issues are there. And they are not just for people who live in big cities. This is the other line I got. I spoke last week in Lincoln, Nebraska, and one of the audience members said, yeah, I know if you have, you're giving up liberty if you live in places like New York City, but we're in Nebraska. This will never happen to us. I'm afraid it is in line to happen to you. And it's interesting how it's a national issue. Conservatives are distracted by the Michelle Obama half of the equation, where most of what she's done is pretty innocuous, actually. And we're not paying attention when President Obama named to head the Centers for Disease Control none other than Thomas Frieden, Bloomberg's health czar in New York. To me, that's a lot more interesting, a tipping of his hand, than anything Michelle has done, much of which, as I say, is kind of innocuous. The other thing that the Obama administration is doing in this area is funneling massive grants, millions and millions and millions of dollars, to localities that are willing to do things like propagandize against salt and fat, and for outright lobbying in order to stir up these local initiatives to have the county ban Happy Meals or to have the town ban the location of fast food restaurants through zoning. You thought these things were just springing up because someone was interested in them. The fact is that the federal government, your money, has been paying for those things to spring up everywhere. So I don't know whether we can defund Obamacare in general, but the fact is that Obamacare has a slush fund which is going to be throwing off $2 million, often insulated from the appropriations process in Congress, in order to do health interventions, including propaganda and much else. I don't know if we can defund the rest of Obamacare. Please, let's at least defund that. Well, let me close by quoting C.S. Lewis, who said, some of you I know have heard this quote, but he said, "It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience." Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. I want to ask a quick question, just maybe like a 1-minute response, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. Just real quickly, what can be done to kind of stop this government and control of our diets? I'll just go down the line.
All right. I think you all hear me? I mentioned, or at least alluded to it during my presentation, which is that we could trust the policymakers to make better policy, but we're not that foolish. So we need to sue them. When governments violate our rights, we should sue them. I went to law school for that reason. And I think it's very evident that in places like New York City, with the soda ban, when Mayor Bloomberg bans soda, you sue him, and it looks like you'll be successful. So I think that's always the right answer. Thanks.
Taking part in the regulatory process, some of these are, you can still do part of, there is part of comments. Some of these regulations are still open for comment. You can do, there are things to do. There's, hopefully at a local level, it's easier to do pushbacks. I mean, it's, I mean, that would really sort of ultimately be, I think the solutions are hopefully more at the local level, and in the federal level, you just hope that some of these regulations just die before they actually, even come to that point.
So I think, in large part, the easiest solution to this is that we need to take personal responsibility for ourselves. As the obesity rates decrease, and they are, or at least leveling off, the call for policy has, as you can imagine, decreased somewhat. And what we're seeing is that we haven't seen an appreciable decline in personal responsibility in the United States, which is what the other side will argue, and they'll say, well, we've just become addicted to food. Well, the easiest solution is that individuals have to start taking responsibility for their weight, and the regulators will have fewer reasons to actually suggest that they have to. The most difficult point to argue on obesity regulatory policy is that it costs money to the state governments. And I think that the numbers are definitely padded, if you will. It's hard to avoid terrible puns when talking about obesity policy. But that being said, there is something to that. And so the more people that take responsibility for themselves is the fewer, or the less ability the regulators will have to call for these policy changes.
Make fun of them. I would say that. I'm a humorous writer, but it really actually works better than most of the other tactics. Bloomberg is too rich to care what else happens, but he really, really doesn't like being made fun of. And apparently he was terribly upset during the soda thing when Twitter went wild with the hashtag Bloomberg movie titles. Things like, I know what you ate last summer, the appropriately sized Lebowski, No Country for Old Menus, Diet, My Darling, and of course, 16 Carrots. I know a lot of politicians. This being made fun of actually does bother them in a way that most of the things we'd like to try doesn't. So try that.
One thing we did is the 2 days after he introduced his policy, and I know that I'm with everyone on the panel, I don't like using the word nanny that often, because I think you're right, it gives a positive image. We did find an image of Miss Doubtfire, or a similar Miss Doubtfire-esque, and we photoshopped Bloomberg's face on it, she was wagging her finger, and put it in the New York Times. And it definitely got his attention. I think his response was, I would never wear a dress that ugly. But in large part, it's sort of, it made the point and drove it home. So,
Real quick, on the soda ban, my understanding is Bloomberg's still trying to push forward with it. And really, the only reason why it got shot down in the courts was not really a substantive kind of reason based on freedom or anything, but more of a separation of powers type
But
of
that
issue.
is freedom, actually, rightly understood.
No, that's
because
true.
he was being Napoleonic. He was ignoring the clear dictates of New York law for how such a law would have to be passed. And I consider that a thrilling victory for liberty, even though the court didn't reach some of the issues that you mentioned.
And I do, but it seems like that's still an open question down the line as to whether or not they could go as far.
The thing is, these policies, and Balin has written a wonderful couple of columns about these policies are deeply unpopular. Even in New York City, they have majorities against them, and you can imagine how unpopular they are elsewhere. Forcing it to go through a legitimate process where the city council has to sign off will screen out a lot of the bad ideas.
Okay. Let's take questions from the audience now. And just state your name and affiliation if you can, and we've got someone with a microphone, so if you have any questions, we have a question up here up front, and just wait till he...
Please let us know what you ate for breakfast also.
That's right.
I'm Jennifer Clausen with Cedarville University. And my question is about school lunches, and particularly free lunches. I never allowed my children to buy chocolate milk when they took their money to school, and I don't want my tax dollars to go for other children's chocolate milk. So how do we handle the fact that we are subsidizing the school lunches?
I have been interested by the literature on chocolate milk, believe it or not, there is one, which suggests that some kids can be made to drink milk if the chocolate milk option is available who would not otherwise be prevailed on to drink milk. On school lunches, The fact is that as a libertarian, the best answer I can think of, well, the second best answer, the best answer involves a more radical approach to education, but the second best answer is for the government to try to behave as if it were a market school responding to the parents, which means not a one-size-fits-all answer, but it means that the tastes in some places are going to be different and more health-oriented than the tastes in other places, depending on what the parents would have prepared themselves if they had been able to get together and run the school. And so to me, there is no single answer. I don't get particularly upset when I see, Greenwich, Connecticut banning a lot of these food options that the parents also don't let the kids have at home. I don't want a single national answer.
Keep Food Legal has an as-yet unfunded option, which is opt out of school lunch. Basically, there are two tracks. One, a parent like you, a mom like you, would send your kid to school with whatever food you want your kid to eat, which I don't think is that foreign an idea to most people. Some people can't afford school lunch, and so they're subsidized by the government. They could also be subsidized by private individuals, and that's what we argue. Restaurants have lots of good leftovers from the night before. Basically partnering up between schools, between private industry, between nonprofits. That sort of thing is a real solution that can make sure that everyone eats healthy and that kids are eating things that their families actually want them to eat. And it doesn't involve much of the government at all.
I mean, I was one of those people, I mean, to me, milk is the most disgusting things in the world, and there's no way I would have ever drunk any milk if my mom hadn't put chocolate in it, honestly. So, but my kids don't drink chocolate milk, thankfully.
Any more questions?
It's one of those, take a second best solution.
Actually, let me get a question back there.
I'm Lisa Gable with the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation, and I was pleased to see that Dr. Olson mentioned the amount of grants going to pay for advocacy on the local basis. But another great source of government funds is being used to drive research around nutrients and litigation tied to those nutrients. Have you looked into that?
A little bit. There's so much that without turning to it full time, it's hard to track all the different bad ideas the government is funding. But I would love it if you sent me details on that, because if you there are two good articles that I can recommend on the slush fund approach to changing the debate and lobbying that the administration is engaged in. One is Mark Hemingway has a short piece in the Weekly Standard this summer. Stuart Taylor has a longer investigation in Forbes of some of the silly areas and some of the really disturbing and upsetting areas in which the government is in some ways short-circuiting the natural debate among scientists and among parents by making sure that one side of various debates gets a megaphone.
Any other questions? We have one right here.
Mark Clausen, also with Cedarville University. My question is a little more arcane. Could any of you recommend what you consider to be the best work on behavioral economics?
Actually, Chris Koopman and I just did, we did a summary that has a whole bunch of links to various things if you want to go on our website. I mean, I do think, Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is a really nice introduction if you haven't read anything at all. It's a really, and it's pretty non-technical. And that's where I would start.
There's a researcher out of Cornell, Wayland, I think he's actually on your board now that I think about it.
Yeah, Brian Wansink.
Brian Wansink, he has written a book, and I'm forgetting the name, but he runs the food lab there. You've probably seen, he every once in a while shows up on 60 Minutes showing how irrational we are. So his most famous example is he had a soup bowl where he could pump soup into the bottom of the bowl without the person eating it knowing. And he found that the size of the bowl determines just how much soup that you eat, and that if you give someone one of these very wide bowls that you would get at a nice restaurant, they will eat like twice as much soup as was actually in the bowl. But his book talks about all of the irrationality, but specific menu labeling. He was one of the only researchers. He's I think seen as being kind of part of the public health community. He's definitely one of them. They don't disregard him, even if he is part of your organization. But he did a fantastic study that showed that people who ate at McDonald's versus people who ate at Subway, when you go to Subway, which has what he refers to as a health halo, that you say to yourself subconsciously, and frankly we've all done this, okay, well, I'm having a healthy lunch, which then makes you say later on during the day, I had a healthy lunch, I'm going to go get a 3 o'clock snack. Or alternatively for dinner, when you're then at home and you say, you know what, I had dessert, I had a healthy lunch. And that the health benefits of eating at Subway might be 150 calories different between Subway and McDonald's, but that you then overshoot the 120 calories by 400 or 500 calories in the end. And what he found is that by giving people menu labels, that giving them these signposts, they actually created these incredibly irrational trade-offs and bargains in their head related to how they were behaving, and that these things might, and now his most recent research has actually now demonstrated that that is exactly the case.
As a law person, I'm biased toward the law literature. I managed to look up the article I wanted to recommend, Behavioral Law and Economics, Its Origins, Fatal Flaws, and Implications for Liberty. The authors are Joshua Wright, the incredibly good Federal Trade Commission member, and Douglas Ginsburg, the incredibly good appeals court judge in Washington. Dynamite paper.
Yeah, that's really good. But it is, we have that included. That's one of the things we cite, that Chris and I cite in our, we have another little summary of this whole, the literature. So, yeah, that is a really awesome.
We have a question right here.
It's a really awesome
Thank
paper.
you.
My name is Alyssa Silkwood. I work here at Heritage. I was diagnosed with celiac disease about 8 years ago. And so recently with the FDA doing regulation on making food, like labeling as far as actually it being gluten-free, I don't know if any of you guys do any work with talking about allergies and then food labeling that goes with that. Because of course, food labeling is important to some degree for, say, those that live a gluten-free lifestyle. But then at the same time, it's regulated at that point. So I don't know kind of the loopholes that kind of fall in there. If you could talk about that.
I've written about this a good deal for a reason, and in law reviews and whatnot. And I wrote about the gluten-free issue. I mean, I think they set it at something like 20 parts per million, if I remember correctly. And there are some people in the celiac and other sort of gluten-free communities who think that that's much too high. Again, if you eat 4 different items that have that label on it, you don't know exactly what sort of range is in there. My plea was that private labeling was a better solution in that case. I think that the FDA is right when it requires ingredient labeling, for example. Historically, the government's required that, making sure that food isn't adulterated, that you're not lying about what's in your food. I think that's important too. It makes sense. Especially food that's in interstate commerce. I mean, under the Commerce Clause, I think the FDA has that authority. But where it starts to, sort of go off the rails is when it requires additional things, gluten-free, or, there are a lot of successful private labeling schemes. There's, there are paleo-approved labels. There's, trying to think of others. There's humane labeling. If you want to, you care about how animals were treated, and that's the way that you buy food. Whole Foods has their private 1 through 5 scale, 1 through 4 or 5 scale on animal treatment. I mean, there are all sorts of different options in the private world that people look for, and I think that when the government tries to take those over, as it did with organic labeling, no one is cheering in here like, organic labeling is so awesome. And I think, 20 years ago, people would have said, wow, California Certified Organic Farmers is doing a great job. I trust their products, or Oregon Tilth, or things like that. Now, nothing against the state labeling authorities, but the USDA takeover, basically, they've redefined organic and taken the sort of meaning out of it.
Thank you. Go ahead.
One aspect of menu labeling, or not menu labeling, labeling in general, that I think sort of goes to the theme of our panel that we were discussing, is that gluten-free is the new, does not contain trans fats, and does not contain trans fats was the new, does not contain fat or low-fat salad dressing, and that in the government's prognostications or pronouncements of certain evil food additives, they then create what someone who we all disagree with, but who agrees with us, a professor at NYU named Marion Nessel, has deemed the calorie distractor. And that is, as we go back to talking about the behavioral economics of all of this, that we're not exactly the most rational people, that when the government then creates a category that people irrationally perceive it as to be a weight loss tactic, because ultimately 90% of people who say that they try to eat healthy are really just trying to lose weight. And as a result, what we've seen with gluten-free, and what is frankly for people who are actually diagnosed with celiac disease, a huge boon for them, but otherwise a very sad thing for the other 10% of Americans that are trying to not eat gluten, but who think that they are trying to do it because they don't want to lose weight. It has nothing to do with weight loss. And that by creating these artificial categories that the government has created, whether it was New York City with trans fat free or now the federal government with gluten free, you're setting people up for failure. And we are actually creating something that it isn't. And maybe there's an informational problem there. You know, the word trans fat was really deceptive because it was not that the trans fat was making you fat, but rather that it was increasing your blood cholesterol. And so with gluten-free, I think it's actually been interesting, some folks on the other side who normally champion these kinds of labeling initiatives in the government have now said, or at least been skeptical that they would actually, do good. Only because the number of people who are truly celiac is relatively low, so.
I mean, people tend to do this, they tend to use one piece of information to make a judgment call. You don't actually go through the whole list of ingredients and decide, okay, I'm going to do this. It's incredibly time consuming. The thing is, I had kids with life-threatening allergies, so I've done this. I also have weird religious dietary restrictions, so I'm actually one of those people who, when I do any kind of processed food, I have to scan the entire list. And it's a pain in the neck. It takes forever. And this is why, that becomes your shorthand. You use one label that's really prominent because that's the information you use to process it. In some ways, it's rational. It's a rational use of your time. But it doesn't really help when it comes to obesity. It can help, if you actually have the illness. If you have the condition, that takes care of it. But when it doesn't take care of the other problems. So it's a very limited use. And as long as we're aware of what you're trying to accomplish, that's one thing.
I want to thank all of you. I want to join me in thanking the panel, please. And I believe there's food out there, and it's not going to be labeled.